Hey crafters, thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to make an autumn fairy card with VersaFine Clair ink and products from Lavinia Stamps. Hope you enjoy! So I used a piece of cardstock, which is 5 by 7 inches, the same size as my finished card, to start this card. And I put my circle mask onto my background so that it was slightly off the bottom of the card. And then I used my summertime ink. And because I used craft cardstock for this, it kind of mutes the color palette a little bit, and it gives it more of an autumnal feel, which I really like on this card. Now once I've finished inking up my sunset, I used the mask that's the same size and taped this in place with some post-it note tape. And then using some glamorous ink, I put this on the bottom half of the card. And when I was applying the ink, I was quite light-handed because I knew I was going to put more ink on top, so I didn't want the color to be too dark. Now once I was finished with that, I just removed the mask for a few moments to put some more ink around the outside of the sunset, just to make sure that it was a nice blend of colors and there wasn't a stark line of craft card in between. Then I added some acorn ink on the top half of the card, and again I was being very light with this ink. Now to add some more texture to the background and to kind of give the illusion of a forest, I used the Lavinia stencil. This one is called Pods, and the same acorn ink. And I moved the stencil around to various places, just adding that beautiful acorn ink into the background. And I didn't want the entire area to be covered, so I'm just picking and choosing parts of the stencil and overlapping areas so that the background is very random and it looks like a forest. Just gorgeous. So I'm just going to repeat the stencil a few more times until I'm happy with my background. And again, I want the pattern to look random and like it's overlapping to give the illusion of depth. So once I'm happy with the background, I can start adding in my Lavinia fairies. So I started with Bron, and I made sure to use a lot of VersaFine Nocturne ink so that there was a nice clear and crisp image, and I stamped her on the right hand side of the card. And for this card, I was thinking that I would use 2 different fairies and color them similarly so they looked almost like sisters or fairy sisters. So because Bron is facing the left of the card, I wanted to add one of the fairies that faces to the right of the card. So I use Seren, who's one of my favorite fairies, and I stamped her on the opposite side of the card. But really, you could use any of the fairies because they're all equally beautiful. So I'm just going to make sure that I have enough pressure on the back of the stamp, and I give it a few moments before I remove it, just to make sure I have a nice impression on my card. So now to add a bit of background on the card, I'm going to use the Hill acetate mask from Lavinia Stamps and some of that same acorn ink just to ink blend on the bottom of the card. And that will help to ground the fairies and cover up the bottom of that sunset, so it gives a really nice balance of the acorn color as well. Now to add a bit of brightness into Seren's lamp, I used a little bit of the cheerful ink. Now because this is craft cardstock, it doesn't show up as well as if it were on white cardstock, but you can see the yellow just sort of peeking through there. And then I used one of the fairy charms. This one kind of looks like a bluebell, and I stamped it just above Bron's hand, cleaned off the bottom of the stamp and re-inked it so that I had a continuous vine, and so the stamp would also reach her hand. And then I used the same stamp around the top of the card just to add in some atmosphere for these two fairies. Now I wanted these fairy charms to stand out a little bit more because I thought they were getting a little bit lost with this Rainforest ink. So after I finished stamping all of my fairy charms, I cleaned off my stamp, and then I used some of my favorite gold ink, and I put it just on the flower part of the stamp, and then I stamped on top of those little bluebells. And that just gives a little hint of color, which helps them stand out a little bit more. And I repeated this on all of the fairy charms on the background. And then to add a little bit more gold on the card, I used my jelly pen to add some gold highlights to both of the fairies. And so I used the gold on their hair and a little bit on the lamp as well, just on the fire area there. And this is the Stardust pen, and they're quite sparkly and they show up really well on darker cardstocks. And these Stardust pens come in a few different colors, including a clear, but I'm using the colored ones today. So after using the golden color on both the fairies' hair, I used the green color on the fairy on the right, Bron, and I just colored in half of the areas on her wings. And I did the same thing with the other fairy on the left, but I used the rose color, which is sort of a dark red color. And when you're using these pens, you just need to be careful that you don't smudge the area because it does take a few seconds for them to dry. Now to fill in those areas that aren't green and rose on the fairies, I'm going to use this pen, which is the Glaze color. And it sort of looks purpley when you put it on, but it dries clear. And it sort of looks like glossy accents, but not as thick. And it just gives a nice look to the wings to make them look a bit more like fairy wings. So I'll let those dry, and you can see how they go on quite thick. And when they're dry, it's nice and sparkly and shiny. And then I'll just use a black gel pen to outline that lamp just to make sure it stands out. And then once I'm happy with that, I'll add a little bit more ink onto the background of the card. So I'll start by adding some acorn ink just around the outside to add a nice border. And then finally, I'll add some Nocturne ink on top of that acorn. And when I use the Nocturne ink, I'm just going to emphasize the corners. So I'm not worried too much about the areas in between the corners. And that just helps to bring the attention to the foreground. And then as a finishing touch on the front of the card, I'm going to use some glossy accents over top of that lamp. And when that dries, it'll have a nice glassy effect. On the inside of the card, I'm going to use a few different fairies. These are from the Fairy Foragers set. It's a group of 4 cute little fairies. So I'll put one on the left here, and then I'll add my sentiment. And Lavinia Stamps has a few different sentiments that are in the Heartfelt Verses set. So this is one of them. It says birthday wishes. And then I'll add one more fairy on the right hand side. And when I stamped this fairy, I must have got a little bit of ink on the bottom of the stamp. So there's a little bit of that acorn ink underneath her foot. So I'm just using a white gel pen to cover that up. And then once I've given my card a few moments to dry, I can put it all together. And you can see that glossy accents dries and it looks a bit like glass. And then I'm going to just glue my card front onto my card base. And as I mentioned before, this is a 5 by 7 inch card. So once that's glued in place, my card is finished, and you can see the inside and the outside there. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please subscribe so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. Have a crafty day!